breadcrumbs sprinkled on a moonlit forest path, a gingerbread house glowing with warmth amid the darkness, a wicked witch, a burning oven, and children triumphant. You think you know the story of Hansel and Gretel, the charming fairy tale about two clever children who outsmart an evil witch and return home with her treasure, a simple moral fable about stranger danger and the power of sibling bonds. But the Hansel and Gretel you know is a lie, a deliberately sanitized fiction crafted to obscure something far more disturbing. The familiar tale wasn't created to delight children or teach them simple lessons about not talking to strangers. It was born from something much darker, a historical record of infanticide, cannibalism, and the unimaginable horrors inflicted by the Great Famine that ravaged Europe in the early 14th century. A period when parents abandoned their children to die in forests, when the starving consumed human flesh, and when the traumatized survivors encoded their experiences into stories that would echo through generations. The truth about Hansel and Gretel isn't just unsettling, it's devastating. And once you understand its origins, you will never view this children's story the same way again. Picture Europe in the early 14th century, a continent in the grip of what historians now call the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Rain falls incessantly, day after day, week after week, month after month. Fields become swamps. Seeds rot in the sodden ground. Crops fail catastrophically across the continent. Now, imagine the barns empty, the grain stores depleted, the livestock slaughtered. The wealthy hoard what little food remains while the masses starve. In these conditions, desperation takes root and blooms into horror. The historical record speaks with terrible clarity about what followed. Johannes de Trocolo, a monk chronicling the famine at St. Albans Abbey, wrote, "The lack of food drove the living to feed on the dead, and God help us, even on the living." Court documents from the period record cases of parents abandoning their children in forests to die, unable to bear witnessing their slow starvation. Archives in Ghent contain accounts of mothers who shut their eyes as they walked away from their crying infants, leaving them to the mercy of the woods. But the horror doesn't stop there. The Brunswick Analyst, recording the events of 1316, reported, men and women were caught secretly devouring their own children. A French chronicler wrote of prisoners in Erfurt fighting over the flesh of executed criminals. The Swiss accounts tell of open graves and consumed corpses. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a continent-wide collapse, where the normal constraints of human behavior fractured under the weight of starvation. The famine killed between 10 and 25% of Europe's population. Millions died, and those who survived carried psychological wounds that would never fully heal. This massive collective trauma didn't just vanish when the rains finally stopped and the harvests returned. It embedded itself in the European psyche. And the survivors did what traumatized humans have always done. They encoded their experiences into stories that would both preserve the memory of what happened and transform it into something that could be comprehended, contained, even shared with children. The breadcrumbs that formed such a memorable part of the Hansel and Gretel tale weren't a charming narrative device. They represented the actual breadcrumbs that desperate parents scattered to lead abandoned children deeper into forests, giving them false hope of finding their way home while ensuring they would become lost. Contemporary accounts from regional courts in Hesse and Thuringia, the very regions where the brothers Grimm would later collect their tales, document cases of parents charged with child abandonment who confessed to using this exact method. The court records of Fulda contain the testimony of a father who admitted to leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that his children followed until they were hopelessly lost in the forest. The gingerbread house, that icon of childhood wonder, transforms into something far more sinister when viewed through the lens of the Great Famine. Wilhelm Maurer, the German folklorist who studied the original oral versions of these tales in the 19th century, discovered consistent references to houses made not of gingerbread but of actual bread, a tantalizing impossibility during the famine when even the wealthiest struggled to secure flour. In these earlier versions, the witch's house was a hallucination born of starvation, a mirage that lured desperate children deeper into the forest with the false promise of sustenance. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The witch, that cackling villain of countless children's nightmares, wasn't originally a witch at all. In the earliest versions of the tale documented by Dr. Heinz Röhlicke at the University of Wuppertal, who studied the original notes of the Brothers Grimm, the antagonist wasn't a supernatural creature, but a very human woman driven to madness by starvation. A woman who had discovered that luring lost children to her home provided the only reliable source of meat available. The witch was, in the original tellings, a cannibal, not a fantastical monster, but a human being who had crossed the final terrible threshold that separates civilization from barbarism. The cage where Hansel is imprisoned appears in court documents from the period. Alderman's records from Wartburg describe a woman accused of keeping kidnapped children in a wooden cage, feeding them scraps to fatten them before slaughter. This wasn't fairy tale fantasy. It was historical reality recorded by government officials. The records specify that the woman fed the children a gruel made from stolen grain, checking their fingers through the bars to feel when they had gained sufficient weight, a direct parallel to the witch feeling Hansel's finger to determine when he is plump enough to eat. Even the seemingly triumphant ending, the children pushing the witch into her own oven, carries horrific historical resonance. During the height of the famine, multiple accounts across the German states record incidents of desperate people crawling into bread ovens to lick the residue of flour from the walls. Some, weakened by hunger, became trapped and died there. The Brothers Grimm, in their unedited notes housed at the University of Kassel, recorded an oral account from an elderly woman in Hesse who spoke of her grandmother finding a body in an oven during the hungry time. The witch's demise wasn't creative justice. It was a reflection of an actual fate that befell the starving. And the treasure the children find? The early versions are explicit. It wasn't gold or jewels, it was food. Simple, life-sustaining food, the most precious treasure imaginable during a famine. The earliest documented tellings describe the children finding stores of grain, preserved meat, and root vegetables. Only in later versions, as the memory of the Great Famine receded, did this transform into material wealth. The Brothers Grimm themselves unwittingly participated in the sanitization process. Their first published version in 1812 contained elements much closer to the oral traditions they collected, darker, more explicit references to starvation and cannibalism. But with each subsequent edition, particularly after criticism that their stories were too frightening for children, they softened the tale. By the final 1857 edition, Hansel and Gretel had been transformed from a thinly veiled historical account of famine-driven infanticide and cannibalism into a mere fairy tale about a supernatural witch who bakes children into gingerbread. This pattern of sanitization continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. Disney's refusal to adapt Hansel and Gretel, despite its popularity, speaks volumes. Walt Disney himself reportedly called it too disturbing at its core, one of the few fairy tales he believed couldn't be sufficiently sanitized for his audience. Historians at the Walt Disney Archives confirmed that preliminary work on a Hansel and Gretel adaptation was abandoned after researchers delved into its origins. The evidence for the tale's historical foundations doesn't end with the Great Famine. Hansel and Gretel belongs to a specific category of folk tales that scholars call famine stories. Narratives that emerged across cultures specifically in response to periods of starvation. Dr. Maria Tatar, the renowned folklorist from Harvard University, has documented similar stories arising independently in regions as diverse as Russia, Japan, and parts of Africa, all following periods of severe food shortage, all containing elements of child abandonment and cannibalism, and all eventually transformed into fairy tales as the immediate trauma receded. What makes Hansel and Gretel unique is the wealth of historical documentation supporting its origins. The specific elements of the tale align too perfectly with documented historical events to be coincidental. Dr. Jack Zipes, the preeminent scholar of fairy tales at the University of Minnesota, has written extensively about how the Brothers Grimm collected their stories primarily from middle-class women whose families had preserved oral traditions through generations. These weren't remote legends, but the processed trauma of actual events passed down through families who had experienced them. The psychological mechanisms at work in the creation and transformation of Hansel and Gretel deserve special attention. Trauma researchers at the University of Leiden have studied how societies process mass casualty events, noting that the transformation of actual horrors into symbolic narratives represents a collective coping mechanism. The unthinkable becomes approachable when dressed in the trappings of fantasy. Children can be taught about the darkest aspects of human nature without being directly exposed to unbearable historical truths. But here's what will stick with you: the element of parental betrayal that opens the tale. The mother, or stepmother in later versions, who convinces the father to abandon their children in the forest. This wasn't a narrative invention to create villain and victim. It reflected the impossible choices faced by parents during the famine. Court records from the period contain dozens of cases of parents who abandoned their children, believing that giving a few children a chance to survive with limited food was better than watching all their children starve. The original German versions collected by the Grimms make this explicit. The parents aren't evil, they are themselves starving. The decision to abandon the children is made while the parents lie awake at night, listening to the wind howl through a house that contains not a single crumb of bread. Imagine that moment, the whispered conversation between parents, the impossible calculus of deciding which children might have the best chance of survival, the father's resistance, the mother's terrible pragmatism, and beneath it all, the gnawing emptiness of bellies unfilled for weeks. This isn't fairy tale villainy. It's human tragedy of the most fundamental kind, and real parents faced this decision, not in some fictional enchanted forest, but in the documented famine-struck regions of medieval Europe. The Brothers Grimm were not simply collectors of children's stories. They were linguists and cultural historians who explicitly sought to preserve Germanic cultural identity through its folklore. Their work took place in a specific historical context, the Napoleonic occupation of German states, when cultural preservation felt urgently necessary. Their methods were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They collected multiple versions of the same tales, noted regional variations, and attempted to trace patterns of transmission. Their original notes, preserved at the University of Marburg, reveal their awareness of Hansel and Gretel's connection to historical events, even as their published versions increasingly obscured those connections. When Jacob Grimm wrote in his personal correspondence about Hansel and Gretel having the taste of ash and bone, he wasn't employing poetic language. He was acknowledging what he had come to understand about the tale's origins. Wilhelm Grimm later noted in his journal that certain stories they collected seemed to bleed history through their fantastic elements, with Hansel and Gretel specifically mentioned as a tale where the memory of hunger cannot be fully disguised. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Hansel and Gretel story is how it reflects a particular form of historical recurrence. The Great Famine wasn't the only period when the tale gained renewed relevance. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, when portions of Germany again experienced severe famine, court records show a significant increase in cases of child abandonment and cannibalism, and witnesses reported a concurrent surge in the telling of the Hansel and Gretel tale, often with the narrative shifted to reflect contemporary rather than historical circumstances. This pattern repeated again during the famine winters of 1816 to 1817, following the eruption of Mount Tambora, and again during the hunger years of 1846 to 1847, and most devastatingly, during the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 under Nazi occupation. Each time, as hunger stalked the land, Hansel and Gretel emerged from the realm of children's tales to serve its original function, a container for unthinkable trauma, a way to process the collapse of the most fundamental human bonds under the pressure of starvation. Contemporary audiences have no conception of what true famine entails. The visceral, animal desperation of starvation exists beyond our comfortable modern experience. Yet our bodies remember. Our collective unconscious recalls. The enduring power of Hansel and Gretel lies precisely in how it speaks to ancestral memories of hunger, a condition most of its modern audience has been fortunate enough to escape. The witch's obsession with food in the story, her house made of bread, her constant feeding of the children, her preoccupation with cooking, reflects the psychological state of the truly starving, for whom food becomes an all consuming fixation. Hunger researchers at the University of Minnesota have documented how starvation alters cognitive function, creating obsessive thought patterns centered entirely around food. The witch isn't evil, she's starving. Her madness is the madness of famine. Modern neurological research provides further insight into why these stories persist with such power. MRI studies at University College London have shown that fairy tales activate regions of the brain associated with both narrative processing and ancestral memory, what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. When children hear stories like Hansel and Gretel, they aren't simply engaging with fiction. They're connecting with the encoded memories of their cultural ancestors. The fear they feel isn't just literary suspense, it's the echo of actual historical terror passed down through generations. The brothers Grimm understood this dimension of folklore, even without the benefit of modern neuroscience. In their scholarly writings, they repeatedly emphasized that the tales they collected weren't mere entertainment but Kulturträger, carriers of culture through time. They saw themselves not as children's authors, but as cultural preservationists capturing the memory wisdom of a people who had endured centuries of war, plague, and famine. That modern audiences now view their work primarily as children's entertainment would have struck them as a profound misunderstanding of their purpose. The sanitization of Hansel and Gretel reached its apex in the 20th century, when the tale was systematically stripped of its historical context and psychological complexity. Illustrations became increasingly whimsical, with gingerbread houses portrayed as confectionery fantasies rather than starvation-induced hallucinations. The witch transformed from a starving human driven to cannibalism into a supernatural caricature of evil. The parents' impossible choice became simple abandonment, easily condemned by comfortable modern audiences who have never known true hunger. But the darkness persists beneath these cheerful veneers. It's present in the visceral fear children still feel when they hear about the witch checking Hansel's finger. It's there in the primal satisfaction they experience when the villain burns in her own oven, and it's especially present in the profound sense of betrayal they register when they learn that parents could send their children into the forest to die. These reactions aren't simply responses to narrative tension. They're the echoes of actual historical trauma encoded in story form. When you next encounter Hansel and Gretel, perhaps reading it to a child, or seeing it referenced in popular culture, you'll recognize what others don't. Behind the colorful illustrations and simplified moral lessons lies the shadow of the Great Famine. The breadcrumbs scattered not as a clever trick but as a cruel deception. The cage built not by a fairy tale witch, but by a starving human pushed beyond moral boundaries. The oven that consumed not a wicked villain, but the desperately hungry. And the parents who didn't simply abandon their children out of wickedness, but faced choices so terrible our modern fairy tales cannot bear to represent them honestly. This is the true power of Hansel and Gretel, not as a simple morality tale about stranger danger or the triumph of clever children, but as a container for historical trauma so severe that it could only be approached through the buffer of fantasy. A psychological mechanism that allowed survivors to process unthinkable experiences and transmit essential warnings to future generations. A cultural memory preserved through centuries, quietly teaching children about the darkest potentials of human experience while appearing to tell them merely about a witch and her gingerbread house. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The breadcrumbs, the cage, the fattening, the oven, the desperate parents, all of it emerging not from pure imagination, but from the lived experience of people who endured the unendurable and encoded their trauma into a story that could travel through time. A story that would preserve the memory of what hunger can do to the human bond between parent and child, between neighbor and neighbor, between the civilized self and the starving animal that lies beneath. The next time someone dismisses fairy tales as simple children's stories, remember Hansel and Gretel. Remember the court documents that record abandoned children following breadcrumbs into forests. Remember the cages that held kidnapped children during the famine years. Remember the bodies found in ovens as the starving sought the last traces of flour. Remember the parents who made choices no parent should ever have to make. And remember that some stories endure not because they're pleasant fantasies, but because they contain truths so fundamental to human experience that each generation must pass them on to the next. The true horror of Hansel and Gretel isn't the witch. It's the revelation that, under the right circumstances, anyone might abandon their children, anyone might build a cage, anyone might heat an oven, not because they're evil, but because they're hungry. And that is a truth far more disturbing than any fairy tale witch could ever be.